I'm Casey.
I'm Robin. I'm Katie.
I'm Chelsea.
And our assessment was language sampling of English learners. So to start with our KWL, what we already knew is that language sampling should be collected and completed by an SLP that is proficient in the child's language or use a properly trained interpreter. We knew that there are many ways to analyze a language sample, including MLU, MLR, and TTR. And language samples should be used in conjunction with formal assessments as they are an informal way to analyze language.
Okay, and the things that we wanted to know during this project: is language sample analysis a reliable measure to use? How often are SLPs using their own non-standardized procedures? What are the best ways to elicit a language sample? And is a language sample scored or analyzed any differently than it would be for an English language learner?
So some of the things that we've learned from research on language samples in English learners is language samples can provide micro and macro structural level information. Data varies regarding SLPs utilizing standardized assessments versus using their own measures of analysis. Research does show generally positive associations between standardized assessments and language samples. And a language sample is not necessarily scored differently for an English learner, but it just emphasizes the importance of gathering and analyzing a sample in both L1 and L2.
So in this presentation, we will cover multiple things, including options for language sampling and the benefits of each, how to collect and score a sample, how to interpret and present the results, how to analyze the results even further, and then a summary of an EBP article.
Okay, so what are the options available? Casey had mentioned a few of them already, but we have mean length of response, which is MLR, mean length of utterance, which is MLU, and that's what we're focusing on today. There is a requirement of a minimum of 100 utterances, that's best practice. Type token ratio, TTR, terminal units, T units, computer-aided language sample, which we have the PLAN program, the child language analysis, the SALT program, which is the systematic analysis of language transcripts, the PAL, PI analysis of language, and the CP computerized profiling. The benefits of a language sample: it is considered an alternative assessment method to standardized assessments. It shouldn't be used in isolation, but rather in conjunction with a standardized assessment. A language sample allows the SLP to gather information about how an English learner demonstrates conversational skills, uses syntactic structures, uses grammatical competency, and uses language. It also can be a great way to help determine a difference versus a disorder.
So some steps, the steps to collect a language sample. Step one is to elicit that sample. There's different ways to do that. There's narrative samples, discourse sample, in conversation or a story retell. Step two, be sure to video and audio record, because it'll be important for playing back and then analyzing that information further. Step three, encourage responses and ask open-ended questions. If a story retell, they're giving maybe one word, just encourage a longer utterance. And then step four, playback video to transcribe word-for-word utterances. Step five, select method of analyzing. We talked a little bit about different ways to analyze. This one we're specifically focusing on MLU. So then how to score the sample using MLU. Step one, select 100 completely intelligible utterances. So it's really important to get at least 100 utterances. Step two, count the number of morphemes in each utterance, referencing the protocol of what does and does not count, specifically referring to Brown's morphemes and stuff like that. Step three, add all of the morphemes for the 100 utterances to get a total number of morphemes used. And then a little math for step four, divide this number by 100 to attain the MLU.
Okay, so for interpreting the MLU, especially when you're talking to parents or maybe teachers who aren't so familiar with MLU, you might have to break it down a little bit differently. Usually it's completed by comparing the client skills or the child skills to developmental expectations. Specifically, you can use Brown's morphological stages. That data can also be compared to the performance of a child's peers during the same task. And again, as Katie said, the language sample will be collected in both L1 and L2, so it's important to remember that the MLU may vary based on the stage of second language acquisition for that child. The bottom is an example that was pulled from a diagnostic report that you might be presenting to a parent, just describing the MLU for a boy named Bobby. So right here it says the expected MLU for a child between the ages of 2 and 3 years is approximately 2 to 3 morphemes per utterance. Bobby displayed an MLU of 2.07 during spontaneous speech, so compared to that developmental expectation, this score would indicate that his morphosyntactic development is within the average range.
So we're going to do a little movement here. We're going to collect a language sample. This is an example we pulled out of a book. Chelsea and Robin are going to reenact this sample, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to transcribe the sample and then analyze it using MLU.
What's this thing?
I think it's an audio recorder. I don't think you better, honey.
I talking on it?
I think so.
It hearing me?
Yep.
It the ladies?
Yes, it is.
It not like Granny's.
No, Grammy has a bigger one, doesn't she?
Granny's don't have buttons on.
No, that's right. Hers has dials.
They got toys in here?
Sure, here's some. Let's look at some.
Yeah, cars and blue box.
There are some cars in the blue box here.
I want green car.
Okay, here's the green one.
Hey, it went under there.
We'll go get it.
Got it.
Good. Is it running okay?
Yeah, it run good.
Good. Let's see what else is in here.
Look, red car. Donnie had red car.
Yes, Donnie's car is red, but it's a lot bigger than this one, isn't it?
Yeah. Donnie always drives his car too fast.
He does. How do you know?
Daddy say so to me.
Uh-oh. I better not let you ride in his car again.
No, I'm telling him to go slow. You seen him last time? He hit a wall.
Oh, no.
Okay, so that sample seems to probably have been elicited maybe in an unstructured play activity, maybe some objects on the table. We reenacted it very quickly, obviously a natural flow of conversation that would have happened slower. But now what we have here are utterances transcribed. I'm going to pull a board over. I pulled a few utterances from that dialogue. Okay. So I've pulled 3 utterances that I'm just going to briefly kind of analyze. So the first one was, no, I'll tell him go slow. So counting the number of morphemes, we have 1, 2 for the contraction, 1, 1, 1, and 1 for a total of 7 in that utterance. And then the next utterance, I talking on it. You can count 1, 2, talk, and the bound morpheme ing. 1 and 1 for a total of 5. And then the last utterance, yeah, cars in blue box. 1, 2 morphemes for car and the plural s. 1, 1, and 1 for a total of 6. So from here, I'm going to kind of reference back to the full transcription, which is going to be a total of 21 utterances were collected. And so once we transcribe and we count the number of morphemes in each utterance, we can then tally the number of total morphemes. And for this sample with the 21 utterances, it came to a total of 103 morphemes. And so then we want to just divide the total number of morphemes by the number of utterances. So 103 morphemes total to be divided by 100, in this case 21. So that gave us an MLU of 4.9. In this case, the child was 4 years, 2 months, so that would be considered in the developmental range. For a 48 to 50-month-old child, the average MLU is 3.5 to 4.7. This one computed with 21 utterances was 4.9, but that's not necessarily a representative sample because we really do need 100 utterances. That gives us a more reflective sample of an accurate MLU.
Okay, and the final portion is the EBP support for language sampling. Dr. Rose Lugo provided us with a really great article that's fairly recent titled Synthesizing Information from Language Samples and Standardized Tests in School-Age Bilingual Assessment. So the questions that Ebert and Pham had was how well do English and Spanish standardized test scores relate to their English and Spanish language sampling counterpart in bilingual children with primary language impairment. So the participants were 51 school-age Spanish and English bilingual children with primary language impairment, and they were split into two groups, a younger group and an older group. The SLP or SLPA administered the CEL4, and 3 subtests were administered in both English and Spanish. It was concepts and following directions, recalling sentences, and formulated sentences, as well as the receptive one-word picture vocabulary test and expressive one-word picture vocabulary test. So in addition to the standardized assessments, narrative language samples were collected in both English and Spanish using a wordless picture book titled Frog, Where Are You? The analysis measures that they used to analyze the narrative language samples were mean length of utterance in words, and that's looking at syntactic skills, number of different words, which looks at lexical diversity, and then words per minute, which looks at verbal fluency. They also looked at percent of grammatical utterances, otherwise known as GRAM, and narrative scoring scheme, which looks at the macro structure of narratives, and there are 7 components there. There's intro, character development, mental state, referencing, conflict resolution, cohesion, and conclusion. So, based on the results of the study, language samples and standardized assessments, they are not interchangeable. While there were some correlations between subtests and language sample analysis, others were non-significant. So the standardized assessment showed positive correlation when compared to language sample analysis measures that were looking at the same type of skill. So for example, the CEL4 formulated sentences and MLUW, they both look at syntactic skills, which is why they show a higher correlation. Some limitations of the study included small sample size, restricted range of participant abilities, but results of the study do correlate with recent research findings within this area. However, more research is needed.
Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching our presentation.